Early in 2025, I released a YouTube short on this project that suggested the reskinning of this drill was a beautiful struggle. Well, as we all know, beauty is indeed subjective, and for some it certainly is a struggle, but in reality, certain ratios and traits are undeniable. Now, given the passage of time, I'd like to revise that title. It wasn't so much a struggle than cathartic mechanical conversion therapy. In my subjective opinion, it was undeniably worth the effort. This project found its way into existence from the need to replace the belt drive on my kindly donated bench drill. The lid casing was always an issue for me to contend with. I found myself slightly annoyed every time I had to access its innards and grapple with its flimsy construction. A solution was inevitable. Using an offcut of 3mm aluminium sheet, I laid out a basic design and roughly removed excess material from the aluminium blank. Then I took a moment to establish a file exclusionary line and proceeded to move in on the final shape. It wasn't long after this I felt compelled to almost completely remodel the visually offensive components, but before that I had to partially dismantle the drill. After popping the hood, I suited up and proceeded to forcibly remove the hood's contents from its cheap and effective plastic shell. This task was a bit of a challenge, and I believe that was the intention of the design, which I completely understand, and you certainly get what you pay for. But in this case, I didn't pay anything, as the drill was kindly donated by one of my brothers. Thanks, bro. But now I'm paying for it in alternative ways. Using what remained of the original hood as a template and drill guide, it was easy enough to plot out where large openings were needed along with all fixing holes. I also added several access holes to accommodate a few improvements on the original design. Because some of these holes are intended to accommodate electrical wires, deburring and sanding was essential to ensure that when the time arrives for the wire's integration, access is smooth and uninterrupted. As I travelled back and forth confirming the fit and access of everything, I noticed something. The opening where the motor shaft will enter the new base was inadequate and needed to be enlarged. So I marked it out and filed to the line, which subtracted enough material leading to more space for the motor's horizontal movement that tensions the drive belt. When complete, this new component will form what will be the base or chassis of the new belt drive cover, around which I'll form the side walls, which is the next task. And to assist with this, I'm going to first work a little wood into this project. The top of the belt drive housing began with an offcut from a red gum sleeper. So if this offcut was to remain in the workshop, it had to be put to good use by transforming it into a worthy addition to the workshop. At first it had to undergo a little structural conversion, but not before it had been cut down to a workable size. Then taking the freshly shaped aluminium and fixing it in position on the timber using the same fixing holes that'll hold it to the drill, it doubled as a router guide. Then, using a flush trim router bit, I duplicated the shape of the chassis that set the main tone for what would eventually form the overall shape of the belt drive housing. The first pass with the router established a rebate to accommodate the walls of the housing. Then, using a washer with the appropriate offset measurement and a fine line marking pen, I set the perimeter around which the unwanted timber will be removed with the bandsaw. It just so happened that this block was the correct size to establish the required distance from the housing chassis to the inside of the hood. Then it was simply a matter of using a combination square to ensure both components were aligned. To make the walls of the belt drive housing, I used a few offcuts of aluminium tread plate I'd saved from becoming an addition to the scrap heap, and it turned out to be a worthy rescue if you ask me. Then, using various and strategically placed clamps, I combined mechanically applied pressure and brute force to manipulate the tread plate, forcing its compliance to its altered destination, bearing in mind that before my intervention it was destined for the scrap heap. It wasn't long before adherence to the new shape was achieved. Then a carefully applied mark indicated the position on which to rest the hacksaw blade and sever the excess, permanently freeing it to return to the scrap heap. Once filled with the appropriate fasteners, these connection points ensure the formation remains intact and firmly attached to the hood. Once this section was fitted and the correct size confirmed, before removing it, I simply connected the ends with an offcut and rivets. Then it was removed and set aside so I could move on to completing the hood. Yeah, it's indeed strange and concerning behaviour for me to witness. As I edit this footage, I find myself questioning the extent and rationality behind this clearly evident ploy to possibly gain a subscriber or two. I always enjoy using a freshly sharpened blade in a hand plane. However, there are exceptions. Although this sequence was contrived, I believe it proved to be a nice visual segue into revealing the subtext and reason for using the hand plane. Now, as if to prove the hand plane sequence was mildly pointless, I deployed the random orbital sander and sanded over what I'd just established with the plane. If you're new to this channel and you think I've earned it so far, please subscribe, like or share, or all three, or if you're so inclined, you could leave a comment. Okay, moving on. Removing the outer layers of timber revealed naturally formed voids. To deal with some of nature's imperfections, humans have developed the means to combat these flaws. A carefully formed and placed blue tack torus served as an adequate restraint in which two-part epoxy resin was gravity-fed, where it was contained as it penetrated and filled these flaws in nature's design. Once cured and all restraints removed, a quick sanding is all it took and this component was finished. However, knowing what I know now, I suspect there will be a slight alteration in its future. It wasn't my original intention, but as this project was not entirely planned out, my intentions were compromised when I found it necessary to upgrade almost every component. So, I'm also going to remake this switch housing, starting with this bit of 3mm ply as the base to build the new switch housing off. Plastic is indeed cheap and effective, but it can be a real pest. However, for this project, the removed plastic components made good templates from which I took inspiration and measurements. This knowledge was then transferred and used on the parts I made to replace them. This process was repeated throughout the sometimes mildly augmented reproduction of new components for this project, but there were exceptions, of course, as I can't help myself from applying a symbolic fingerprint on the things I make. When it comes to making projects that are mildly complex, at least they're complex for me, generally, before I launch into making anything, I plan it out in the hope of mitigating wasting precious time and, to a lesser extent, materials. Of course, part of the planning includes staying within the parameters of materials I already have at hand, so budget is also important. I believe it's within this framework that problem-solving creativity flows. Alright, so with that in mind, I'd like to add a few more thoughts taken from my own experiences for consideration. Sometimes, when I'm about to do something that's new to me, I approach it with caution. But what presents as a cautious concern for making mistakes can have a paralysing effect that prevents you from making discoveries. Discoveries that would not manifest if a carefully choreographed approach is deployed. That careful approach can inhibit the creative process that is essential for ideas to flourish, although there are exceptions. So when it came to this project, I just dove straight in and addressed, then attacked each problem as it presented itself. I believe there's merit in success as much as failure, as there is value found in both experiences. Success just feels better, which is why we continue with most pursuits, right? Right? Originally, I was going to completely do away with this switch as I found its purpose, well, useless. However, it does perform its intended function well. So instead of relegating it to the electrical components drawer where it may slowly decay, I'm creating a recess for it now as a placeholder for a purpose I have in mind worthy of its integration back into the project. If it's not already obvious, its intended function will be revealed. Usually the best way forward is to adapt and overcome, or adapt to simulate what you would otherwise own in the perfect workshop. As we all know, problem solving is a fundamental skill to exercise when it comes to doing or making almost anything. For me, problem solving can sometimes involve making semi-complex jigs or apparatus, which is an issue I need to work on. Other times, it's as easy as using a few solid steel round bar offcuts. In this case, the round bar offcut served well to simulate an anvil's horn. After multiple targeted blows, the aluminium conformed to the desired shape. Due to the nature of my designs, coupled with my lack of proficient skills and technique, I'm usually unprepared for what is needed to achieve the desired outcome for certain sections on any project I may be working on. I know what the finished piece looks like in my mind's eye, but I'm unsure of how to achieve it given the limits of my work environment. The best case scenario is that you have the right tool for the job. However, it's not necessarily true in every case, but it is true most of the time. But it may lead to limited thinking. So when you can see hidden potential in an object, it's up to you to reveal its other purposes. Now that some of the functional elements of this project have been addressed, I can now move on to the fun stuff and begin adding some style. So I'm starting at the bandsaw and splitting a carefully selected, relatively defect-free section of red gum. Off screen, I made one template to mark out the basic shape of the two components I need. When finished, these two sections will form the left and right hand sides of what will be the switch housing. Although they'll be made from the same template, they won't end up symmetrical because the right hand side has different obstacles to avoid to the left hand side. And this presented a confronting challenge for me as I am a fan of symmetry. Anyway, before I get to the shaping, while these components still have flat surfaces and edges, I can use them as reference surfaces to remove timber, which will allow these new components to sit comfortably against the drill amongst several obstacles. After the template reached its limited use, to really dial in the look I was chasing, and with the help of some strategically placed double-sided tape, I power carved the majority of the unwanted timber away, then refined what remained with hand tools and abrasives until it matched the image I held in my mind's eye. At some point during this project, I took a moment and assessed my progress. It was in that moment it dawned on me that I'd gone further with the project than I originally intended. This realization compelled me to continue on and attempt an entire remake. So I dismantled what remained of the drill, breaking it down and separating each part. These components are from a previous attempt to address the drill's poorly designed depth stop. Over several years, these custom parts have performed well, so there's no need to improve the function. However, I'll use a material that'll improve strength and rigidity. It's not quite the end of the road for these pieces of plywood just yet. Before these components are disposed of, I'll use them as patterns to form their aluminium replacements. Now for me, when it comes to the creative process, generally speaking, the visions that set me off in pursuit of those images are of the final product, which is great. However, the process of getting there is not always as straightforward as I'd ideally like it to be. The anticipation of achieving the final piece is tempered by the path I must take in order to successfully reach my goals. So before I got carried away with the shaping of the new parts, it was with a certain amount of self-restraint when I took advantage of the soon-to-be-lost flat surfaces, using them as best I could as reference planes to establish relatively perpendicular fixing holes. Once I'd established the basic shape of the new individual parts, in order for the two sections to appear as one, I first needed to temporarily join them together, which would ensure they maintain similar contours when I continue blending and shaping. However, in order for the M6 bolts that I originally used in the plywood components to fit, they required some corrective adaptation, which is one of the many requirements when creating custom parts. As the majority of the customizations were already proven on what I now consider to be the prototype, there was very little trial and error required when fitting them to the new components, thanks to the troubleshooting that was done on the original. Most of the work now went into filing recesses and drilling holes, then swapping parts from the old plywood prototype to their new aluminium bodies. During the fabrication of this particular part, I created a recess for the reintegration of a vernier caliper. This caliper was an inexpensive measuring instrument featuring a digital display that's easy for me to read. It may not be precise, but it's a good enough system for an approximation of depth accuracy. Once the new switch housing had been roughly fabricated, I temporarily installed and wired it up and attached the new drive belt. Coincidentally, it was this drive belt replacement that was the catalyst that kicked this project into gear. So with the drill partially assembled and operational, construction continued. While editing this footage, I realised the project turned into more than I originally planned, considering its very humble beginning. I justified the tool's enhancements by convincing myself that if I do it right now, it may end up being more than just a workshop tool. And that's not all. It was also an opportunity to collect more data points to be applied on future projects. But there's only one way to find out, right? Now, as I narrate this video, simultaneously I'm documenting my justification for the unplanned workload that's now embedded in this project. Ideally, tools just work when needed. Unfortunately, tools are susceptible to entropy, and like most things, they require constant maintenance. However, this degradation can be mitigated by using quality materials and a reduction of moving parts. That's one of my primary considerations when making or customizing a tool. Another necessary consideration, and in my opinion is the most corrosive of all resources, is time. As I age, I've become far more cognizant of how much valuable time I burn through. Occasionally I pause production to ask myself, do I really want to spend time customizing workshop tools? To which I answer, well, it depends. It's really a matter of walking a fine line between a workshop that functions as intended or going a step further to build a work environment that also inspires and adds to the experience of creating and capturing my dreams and visions in an object. Sometimes I imagine that if I have everything set up and aligned just right in the workshop, it'll create the perfect work environment in which I can generate a self-perpetuating positive feedback loop of inspiration in which creativity flourishes. This, of course, is an idealized fantasy, but you have to dream big, right? When modifying any tool or apparatus, at some stage the inevitable requisite sacrifice will have to be made. In the case of this project, the sacrificial honour fell on this small integrated cast section that was originally part of the depth gauge. Its performance was grossly inadequate to begin with, so I was more than happy to extricate it from existence. Speaking of existence, I know what exists in the future as a replacement for what I'm currently removing, so I can confidently predict that the sacrifice I'm executing is worth making. This obstacle's sacrificial removal is in fact an offering for which I feel nothing. After an adequate offering was made, the vacated area was prepared and made ready to receive an improvement. Those improvements are custom-made parts, and custom parts require a custom fit, which usually involves a bit of back and forth until the part adequately complies to coercion. After carefully fitting the new parts, I drilled a series of fixing holes that will receive the appropriate fasteners to ultimately secure each custom designed component to its final position. Alright, the cheeks for the new switch housing are fitted and good to go, so now I can move on to making the components that'll hold the depth gauge and the depth stop. It certainly is nice when you have the right tool for the job. In this case, I'd say I had a guide that allowed me to use a tool to achieve the right outcome. You see, I only had 10mm thick aluminium to work with, and to adequately attach the depth gauge, that aluminium had to be reduced to 8mm by any means possible. It may not be what the file guide was intended for, but it worked out just fine. Now I can use the freshly filed 8mm section and make it into a spacer to accommodate the depth gauge and fixings. This single component ended up being more complex than intended, but it was my favourite piece to make. Once installed, its existence will go unnoticed, which in my opinion is what you want from any part. If it doesn't work, you notice it, right? Now, staying on topic, it's been approximately 1 year since I installed this part and it's gone unnoticed. Here's some footage I quickly shot that should give you a good idea of what the finished piece looks like. After cutting and preparing the fixings for this new piece, it was ready to be installed. Well, almost. But before I get to that, there's a few more components I need to fabricate. The very need to make these new components was born out of one of the original contributing reasons for improving and reskinning the drill. Sometime in the recent past, the coil spring that retracts the drill chuck broke, so I replaced it with a simple, vertically positioned spring. It's not as strong as the coil spring it replaced, but I do like the amount of control I now have on the chuck's speed of travel. Now that these components have been successfully fabricated, I can pull the sections apart and remove the depth gauge. When it came to these interlocking parts, I was chasing a precision fit, and within the context of my very imprecise workshop, I believe I was moderately successful because it took a bit of manoeuvring, but eventually the connection was broken. Now that the two sections have been reunited and a solid connection re-established, it's time to take them back to the vise. But before I do that, I'll apply some center reference lines to help my wandering eye stay on target and guide my filing. And from there, I'll start shaping these components into something more appealing. At least, that was my good intention, and the path to hell is paved with good intentions, right? But as you'll see, I don't think it turned out that bad. After a significant amount of filing then sanding, the shaping marathon ended. This piece was then set aside until all the other components had reached a similar condition. Then I polished everything in one session to a level of satisfaction I can live with. Obviously this is a different component, but I'm sure you get the idea. So the plan is to take this piece of LED lighting strip and put it inside, or create a housing that's going to be situated around the chuck of the drill. I'm going to be using aluminium and red gum. The red gum is the remaining section from this piece. And as you can see at this point, I'm yet to dish this out to allow a little more internal space for things to move around and flow freely. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to split it down the guts, clean it up, and then I'm going to glue the two sections back together to form a very robust, chunky 14mm thick 2-ply. And from that, I'm going to be cutting a hoop, and that hoop will be integral to create the housing for the LED lighting. I'm just using what I have around. So the housing will consist of this piece of 3mm aluminum, and this piece of 3mm perspex, or plexiglass, perspex. So I'm going to take this section of timber, head over to the bandsaw, and start the process of making a line. Okay, well that's the 14mm 2-ply taken care of. When it comes to cutting small circular parts, I reckon it's best attacked on a rotating base. But before I go any further, I'm going to seek some graphically symbolic guidance in the form of concentric circles. There's a bit of work to be done on this piece, so to reduce the work even more, I'll remove some of the excess timber. A lot of planning went into plotting out differing depths and allowances to create recesses for other materials to be incorporated into the light housing. I'd love to be able to explain the process, unfortunately I can't. However, I do believe the captured video will be somewhat self-explanatory. I know it looks like a bit of a mess, but it cleans up alright. For now I can set this timber hoop aside to fabricate other components that'll fit into the recesses I just machined. Starting with this piece of 3mm aluminium plate. I made a template off camera with an array of carefully considered then deliberately placed fixing holes. Then, after marking out the disc, I removed the majority of the excess with an undersized hole saw and an appropriately loaded jigsaw. After filing close to the lines, I secured the template within the recently defined border. With the template attached, it was a simple task to drill out the pre-planned fixing holes. Then the template provided substantial guidance around a flush trim router bit. This method produced a more consistent disc than I could have achieved if I continued with the files, although it certainly is possible. That's the top section of the light housing fabricated. Now I can move on to machining the acrylic disc. With the aluminium and acrylic components fabricated, I placed one screw to secure each component. Then, to ensure the components returned to their original position after removing them, I drilled a 3mm hole. Then applied some CA glue and inserted a small section of 3mm steel round bar to serve as a location pin, or relocation pin. It all depends on your level of optimism, I'd say. It's an extra step and you could argue that it's unnecessary, but it is satisfying to witness components easily find their place and stay there. Now, while the edge of the timber hoop retained its flat edge, I used it to my advantage for the point of the 8mm brad point drill bit to easily register the required position before drilling the hole. I knew that drilling the hole first would be an issue later. I decided that once the hole was drilled, I'd temporarily backfill the hole with a small section of 8mm dowel. After I flush trimmed the excess off, the dowel became a valuable contributor to apply and maintain the roundover bit's continuity as its bearing guided the travel around the timber's perimeter uninterrupted, leaving the newly rounded over edge mostly defect-free. The next task was to fabricate a small conduit for the electrical components that'll travel through it and line the inside of this round structure. I made the conduit from selecting metal tubes I'd saved over the years that featured a variety of diameters that fit neatly into each other. When cut, bonded and assembled, they'll provide uninterrupted access for wiring. At least that's the plan. I know it looks like a lot of work, but is it really work? because I believe my objective is a worthy one, as it is an attempt to provide some extra light for my aging eyeballs to see better. As I mentioned earlier, during a rare direct-to-camera appearance, the timber component of the belt drive hood needed to be dished out. So again, off-camera, I made a router guide, secured it in place, then using a dish-cutting router bit, I removed the unnecessary timber. When I'd sufficiently smoothed out the freshly milled surface, I placed it amongst the other timber components and painted them off-camera. And now, after painting the timber components and polishing the metal to a reasonable standard, it's time to begin the final assembly. Although the filming of this project was comprehensive, some elements were excluded, such as these two small pins that guide the aluminium disc back to its original position. You may have noticed the light components to easily relocate, but I didn't want to make a big deal of it. While editing this project, in an attempt to maintain sequential continuity on this video's timeline, I've had to move certain components that were built from where they occurred on the actual timeline and edit them into this video's timeline. I've done this in order to display a certain fluidity to the construction sequences and hopefully mitigate any confusion. Or maybe it's just me that's confused. So with that lengthy explanation in mind, this sequence didn't actually occur on this timeline. However, I believe it makes more sense to insert it here to give what follows some context. Originally, the drill came with laser center point reference guides. Now, although I believe this modern edition is well intentioned, at best it only serves as a rough approximation of the desired target. There may in fact be optimal versions of the laser guidance system out there on the more upmarket models of drill, but I have no desire to do the research for an edition that in my opinion is more of a gimmick. So with that in mind, I rummaged through my electrical components drawer where I found a transformer and LED light strip offcuts that would suit my light design. I believe a better and far more practical addition to any work area or surface is good lighting. With the combined strength of timber, aluminium, acrylic and an excessive amount of fixings, I believe I achieved significant combined strength with a moderate amount of style while maintaining a low profile. It was another objective satisfactorily achieved. Now I can pick up where I left off earlier and get on with the rest of the final assembly. However, there are a few more slight detours. Some time ago, I drilled, tapped and threaded an old nut to convert it into a depth stop. It's proven its worth, so I'll complete its metamorphosis by removing its angular appearance. Slight detour. I had a particular vision for this project, so to capture this vision, I took a walk down the plumbing aisle of my local hardware store and found exactly what I was looking for: plumbing supplies to house the transferal of electrical current. Because these braided hoses were intended for a customised application, it required me to fabricate a few additional parts. As I'd already threatened to blow the budget of this project, I made my own large washers that doubled as spacers. Okay, so if you've come this far in the video and you like my style of content, if you think I've earned it, please consider supporting my channel by buying me a coffee. You'll find a link in the description. After a few adjustments and further customization of off-the-shelf parts, the drill could receive power and I was almost ready to use it. Earlier I made reference to the issues of working with plastic parts. Off camera, I solved this plastic connector issue with a bit of copper tube and a couple of small brass bolts. With the gaining momentum of the assembly coupled with the length of this video, rather than taking a detour on a topic related to this project, for those of you that are interested, I released a dedicated video on the making of this knob. Now I know it's small, but looks can be deceiving. There's a link in the description. I'm fairly certain that at some point during this video I mentioned my complicated relationship with the modern world's favourite building material, plastic. So I'm sure it comes as no surprise that off camera I turned a fresh set of knobs on the lathe. As I have no plans to make any further changes to this project, I fixed them into their final position with 2-part epoxy resin.